Black man in uniform? Must have borrowed it from a museum. Deputy Sheriff Ryan Maddox sneered as he shoved the man into the defendant's chair. No ID, no lawyer, no resistance. But a single secure phone call, cold and precise like a death sentence, froze the entire courtroom in stunned silence. No one had expected that the man in handcuffs was a major general who once commanded a top-secret military unit, and the one who mocked him, now pale-faced, hollow-eyed like a ghost. If this happened right in your city's courtroom, what would you do? The courtroom was already half full when the doors opened again. A man entered, tall and motionless in his step, dressed in a perfectly pressed military uniform that bore insignia only a few could read, but all could sense. The cloth carried history. His gaze was steady, unfaltering, sweeping across the room without landing on anyone. Not one camera turned, not a single gasp. The man in uniform walked as if the floor itself obeyed his boots, yet no one recognized him. He took his seat at the defendant's chair without saying a word. No one stopped him. No one questioned his right to be there. He didn't bring a lawyer, didn't ask for one, didn't even glance at the legal aid notice pinned to the courtroom wall. Whispers stirred like smoke. The air grew tight, humid with unspoken tension. A few eyes flicked toward him, uncertain. Then came the voice. Sharp, mocking, familiar. "What's this?" Deputy Ryan Maddox leaned sideways in his seat, mouth curled in an effortless smirk. "Borrowed that getup from the War Museum, huh?" A dry chuckle escaped his throat, more for show than humor. His uniform was police issue, creased, carelessly open at the collar, and his posture screamed authority drunk on itself. Someone in the gallery murmured, "A black guy in military dress? In this courtroom? Probably picked a fight somewhere." The words weren't loud, but the venom carried. The man in uniform didn't turn his head, didn't twitch. He simply glanced once, sideways, no emotion, no retaliation, and then directed his eyes straight toward the seal mounted behind the judge's bench. The national emblem gleamed under courtroom lights, his stare fixed on it like a sight line. The judge hadn't arrived yet. The bailiff was pretending not to listen, but everyone was listening. The man didn't move. His back stayed straight, arms resting calmly, as if the room were a waiting station he had visited before, long ago, under different circumstances. There was something about the way his shoulders sat, so still yet full of recoil, that made people uneasy. They didn't know why. They didn't know who he was. That was the worst part. They had no frame of reference, no label to pin him under, no name, no narrative, just the overwhelming presence of a man who shouldn't be sitting where he sat, who looked too put together to belong in that chair. That very contradiction unsettled them more than any outburst ever could. Maddox shifted in his seat, clearly relishing the discomfort, his voice laced with sarcasm. "No legal counsel?" He raised a brow. "Guess cosplay doesn't come with benefits?" A few people laughed, but the laughter sounded nervous, clipped. The man didn't respond. His silence stretched the space between them like a fault line, waiting to snap. Maddox leaned back, sipped his coffee, acting unbothered, but his eyes were watching, curious, probing. There was something familiar he couldn't place, and that, too, irritated him. The man's boots were polished to a dull mirror, reflecting just enough light to draw attention but not enough to gleam. On his chest were medals and ribbons, worn with the kind of composure that made people second-guess their judgments. But still, no reaction from the crowd except more muttering. His skin color, his posture, his refusal to speak, it all combined into a narrative they didn't have the vocabulary for. He didn't fit any box, and that terrified them. He hadn't asked for anything, not leniency, not understanding, not even the dignity of being seen. He just sat there, as if the courtroom had no hold over him, as if he had brought a different kind of law into the room with him, the kind you don't plead to, the kind you don't speak of unless summoned. Maddox's voice sliced through again, louder this time, angling for a reaction. "Guess wearing stars on your shoulder doesn't stop you from landing in the dirt like the rest of us, huh?" Still no reply. Not even a blink. The man didn't even breathe differently. His chest rose and fell with mechanical control, as though he'd rehearsed stillness in a place far more hostile than this one. The judge entered, an aging man with thinning hair and a tired face, looking like he'd seen enough to be cynical about everything. His eyes scanned the room, settling briefly on the defendant. He paused, just for a moment, and then moved on. "Court is now in session," he said, tapping the gavel once. Papers shuffled. A hush fell. The rhythm of courtroom procedure resumed like a well-oiled machine, but the air wasn't right. It was too quiet, too still. The man in uniform didn't shift in his seat. He didn't look at the judge. His eyes remained on the seal, unwavering. The judge glanced at him again, this time longer. Something about the uniform, the way it sat, the way it was worn, didn't match the body language of someone who belonged in that chair. But protocol was protocol. The docket said one name, no aliases, no priors, no statement, no lawyer on record. "Mr. Chambers," the judge finally said, testing the name like a foreign word on his tongue. No response. "Do you wish to waive your right to counsel?" Silence. The man didn't even nod. His presence remained a quiet middle finger to the system, a refusal that didn't require sound. Maddox leaned toward the bailiff. Maybe he thinks if he plays statue long enough, we'll all salute. The bailiff didn't respond. His jaw was tight. His hands were clenched behind his back, knuckles white. He'd seen something in those eyes. Not madness, not fear, something worse, certainty. The courtroom clock ticked. Every second sounded louder than it should have. The people in the gallery began fidgeting. The mood was unsteady. Maddox, growing bored with the lack of engagement, huffed and leaned back again. But even his posture had lost some of its bite. There was something about that silence, that unreadable face, that pressed uniform. It carried more accusation than 1,000 affidavits. The judge sighed. "Very well. This court will proceed under the assumption that the defendant chooses to represent himself." He nodded toward Maddox. "Deputy, you may proceed." Maddox stood, cocky as ever, straightened his shirt and stepped forward. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to begin today's proceedings by addressing the courtroom's collective confusion. See, when someone shows up looking like they stepped out of a vintage war film, naturally people have questions. Like, who the hell does this guy think he is? He turned to face the gallery, not the man in uniform. Because wearing the costume of honor doesn't mean you live by it. And let's be real. When you look like that, he motioned vaguely at the man's skin tone and uniform, and walk in here like you're owed something, people start asking, where do you come from? There was a murmur, a few gasps. Maddox smiled like a butcher sharpening his blade. But don't worry, we'll get answers, eventually. The man didn't blink, didn't even flinch. And that was the most unnerving part. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. And the courtroom, whether it knew it or not, had just stepped into his theater. The silence after the courtroom's first act clung to the walls like the scent of gunpowder after a single shot. Tensed, quiet, but promising more. The air hadn't yet exhaled from Marcus's impenetrable stillness when the doors at the back creaked open again, this time not with grace, but with swagger. The kind of entrance that wasn't earned, only worn like cheap cologne. Deputy Ryan Maddox sauntered in with his badge swinging lazily from his belt, shirt buttons undone enough to show arrogance rather than skin, and a paper coffee cup dangling from his fingers like a cigarette. Every step he took echoed louder than necessary, a calculated thud that demanded attention but deserved none. He didn't look at the judge, didn't acknowledge the court clerk. He had eyes for only one man, and that man was already seated, silent, unmoved, his back straighter than law books. Maddox's grin spread like a stain across his face as he closed the distance. No need for introductions. The game was already underway. As he passed behind the defense table, Maddox drifted just close enough to brush his shoulder against Marcus's. The collision subtle but deliberate, the way wolves nudge the backs of rivals before lunging. He leaned in and muttered low enough for only two men to hear, "Walking like a general, huh? Real shame there's no battlefield here, just you and your costume." Marcus didn't turn, didn't blink. The contact might as well have been wind. His face remained steel, his jaw still, his eyes fixed forward. But Maddox wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for an audience. He moved to the center of the courtroom with the posture of a man too familiar with microphones and too in love with the sound of his voice. He raised his coffee cup slightly in salute to the judge and asked casually, "Permission to speak freely for the sake of clarity, Your Honor?" The judge gave a small, tired nod. Maddox cleared his throat and addressed the gallery, not the bench. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, honed from years of gaslighting, "before we start tossing around legal terms and rules of decorum, I think we should take a moment to address the elephant in the room, or rather, the cosplay." A few heads tilted, a few brows furrowed. Maddox pointed lazily toward Marcus, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "Now I know what you're thinking. That man there, the one dressed like he just stepped off a military recruiting poster from the Cold War? Yeah, him. He looks like a soldier. Hell, he wears the uniform like he earned it. The creases are sharp, the ribbons shine, the boots could blind you." He paused, sipping from his cup. "But you know what they say, costumes don't come with character." The room stiffened, unsure whether to laugh or recoil. Maddox smirked wider. "I mean, sure, he's got the look, but the way he's been sitting there, not saying a word, not answering basic court procedure, that's not the behavior of a war hero. That's the behavior of someone trying hard to pass for one. Like a kid in daddy's clothes, or maybe a guy at Comic-Con who thinks saluting earns respect." He turned to the judge with exaggerated innocence. "Your Honor, I'm just trying to understand. Is this court being asked to prosecute a man or judge a costume contest?" Still no movement from Marcus. No twitch of the brow, no shift in breath. His stillness was a kind of violence, like a threat not yet activated. Maddox chuckled. "See, not even a twitch. That's commitment right there. Silence is performance, a strategy. If he doesn't speak, he can't contradict the story he's trying to sell." He stepped closer, coffee in hand, and stared directly at the defendant. "But here's the part I love, really. It's my favorite bit." He turned back to the crowd, spreading his arms. "This guy thinks if he wears the clothes of a soldier, people won't look at the color of his skin, that the uniform erases what they see first." His voice sharpened like glass underfoot. "Let me save everyone some trouble. It doesn't." A hush dropped like an axe. The courtroom didn't gasp, it froze. Maddox didn't blink. "Y'all see what I see, right? A man wearing a uniform, but not the right kind. Not the kind we're used to seeing in rooms like this." He let it sit, let it rot. "Uniforms don't bleach your blood, don't rewrite where you came from, don't make you better. They just cover up the truth for a little while." The judge gave a faint cough. Maybe it was discomfort, maybe it was restraint, but Maddox knew he'd crossed a line and didn't care. He lived for the taste of his poison. Marcus finally moved. Not a word, not a glare, just a slow, deliberate shift of his gaze. He turned his head a fraction toward Maddox, then looked away again. It was microscopic, but it was enough to erase the last 5 minutes of noise. The room adjusted itself around that movement as if gravity had just declared its allegiance. Maddox took another sip, eyes narrowing. "No defense? No objection? No response at all?" he said, pretending to address the court but speaking straight to Marcus. "I guess it's easier to keep up the act if you don't open your mouth. Less chance of ruining the illusion." He took another step, now directly behind Marcus. His voice dropped, but his words were meant to wound. "You think if you sit real still, real proud, people won't remember what you are. But I remember. I see through all of it. The medals, the boots, the silence. It's a costume. And you, my friend, are just another defendant trying to rewrite his story with wardrobe and posture." Marcus didn't react, but the judge did. "Deputy Maddox," he said sharply, "enough. You've made your statement." Maddox bowed theatrically. "Of course, Your Honor, just clarifying the record." He returned to his seat, dripping satisfaction. The audience wasn't applauding, but that didn't matter. His goal had never been truth, it had always been corrosion. Strip the man in the uniform of dignity without ever laying a hand on him. Let words do the bruising. Let the room do the rest. But what Maddox didn't understand, what no one in that room yet grasped, was that Marcus hadn't arrived to argue, or defend, or plead. He'd arrived to listen, to endure, and above all, to watch. because watching was where real power lived. And though he hadn't yet spoken a single word in his defense, the courtroom was already in his orbit. They just hadn't realized they were moving yet. Maddox sat down like a man who believed he'd already won. His smirk hadn't left since the moment he entered, but now it curled a little deeper, as if whispering to itself, satisfied. He gave the courtroom a look, half pity, half arrogance, as though he were the only one with eyes worth trusting. His fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm too casual for the gravity of the room. Then he flicked a switch on the remote in front of him. The courtroom screen blinked to life. "Let's give the gallery something real to look at," he said, dragging each word like a cigarette drag. Slow, foul, intentional. The lights dimmed slightly, and the screen filled with a video frame, grainy at first, then sharpening into clarity. There was Marcus, dressed the same but standing outside a government building, posture unreadable, expression neutral. In the footage, a local officer extended a hand, asking for identification. Marcus didn't reach for his pocket, didn't say a word. He simply stared, then turned, then walked away. The clip ended there abruptly. No sound, no context, just enough to imply resistance, just short of the full truth. "Play that back," Maddox instructed, voice feigning curiosity. The clip rolled again. "Now pause it." He pointed at the frame where Marcus was mid-turn, the light catching just enough of the ribbons on his chest. "Look at that," he said, addressing the room like a tour guide at a crime museum. "All dressed up, yet not even willing to show a badge, a card, a name. Funny, right? The guy wears medals like armor, but flinches at a basic question." He turned, now fully facing Marcus, voice quieter, cutting. "So tell me, what are you hiding behind those stars? What truth are you trying to bury beneath your shiny little collection of colored stripes?" Marcus didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He sat like marble, breathing like a machine calibrated for patience, unmoved by screams or sneers. His hands rested on his knees, fingers barely curled, tension controlled, violence contained. Maddox chuckled dryly. "What, you think silence makes you noble? You think because you won't speak, you can't be accused?" He leaned closer to the screen, waving at it dismissively. "That man right there ain't a hero. He's a shadow. A question mark wearing honor like a disguise." From a folder on the table, Maddox pulled a printed photo. It was creased, slightly faded, aged and altered. He held it up for the courtroom like a magician unveiling a trick. "Found this in a dusty corner of a military personnel archive. Took some digging. Worth it." He turned the photo toward the audience. It was a younger Marcus. Same steel in the eyes, same quiet spine, but less time carved into his skin. He stood beside a military vehicle in what looked like a desert deployment. Uniform dusty, expression unreadable. The color had been manipulated, the tones exaggerated enough to make the image feel theatrical, almost artificial. "Handsome fella," Maddox quipped, waving the photo slightly. "Is this a war zone or a movie set? I mean, seriously, who stands like that unless they're waiting for the director to yell, 'Cut'?" Laughter tried to erupt but died in people's throats. It wasn't funny, not really. It was sharp, intended to bleed, not entertain. Marcus rose, not fast, not slow, but with the deliberate grace of someone who has risen under heavier weights, in darker places. He stepped forward. His boots hit the floor with dull finality, a sound more precise than loud. He didn't look at Maddox. He looked only at the photo. Maddox hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by the approach. He lifted the picture slightly, unsure whether to retreat or press further. Without a word, Marcus reached out, took the photo with 2 fingers, gently but firmly. He didn't snatch it. He didn't tear it. He held it like something sacred had been dirtied. His eyes scanned it once, as if memorizing its damage, then he flipped it over. The back was blank. He turned it back around, smoothed the crease across the center with his thumb, then placed it gently back on the table in front of Maddox. Then he turned, walked back, sat down. Not a word, but the silence that followed spoke louder than any closing argument ever could. Maddox looked down at the photo, now resting where he had once held it like a weapon. It didn't seem to burn in his hand before, but now, on the table, returned, and undestroyed, it mocked him. It dared him to try again, dared him to find another weakness, but there was none. Marcus hadn't defended himself. He hadn't pushed back. He had reclaimed, and that act, quiet as it was, echoed. The judge shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses. He said nothing. What was there to say? The courtroom was built for arguments, testimonies, evidence. But what do you do when a man fights without a voice and still wins the room? Maddox sat back down, slower this time, like a man recalculating. He'd expected fire, deflection, maybe even a threat. What he got instead was the unbearable weight of being dismissed, completely, silently, with a look and a gesture that reminded everyone watching who still had control. And Marcus returned to stillness, eyes once again on the national seal, body unreadable, breath even. The photo lay between them like a flag planted in disputed ground, a memory twisted, returned, unbroken. No one clapped, no one spoke, but everyone understood. There are battles won without blood. This was one of them. The silence that settled after Marcus reclaimed the photo wasn't gentle. It was razor-sharp, alive with everything Maddox had failed to pierce. No matter how many times he spoke, he couldn't match the gravity of a man who didn't need to. And yet, in rooms like this, power didn't always flow from silence. Sometimes it hid in the robes of the man behind the bench, robes that looked heavy but too often covered only wind. The judge leaned back slightly, watching Marcus for a long moment. He wasn't immune to the spectacle. His eyes flicked down, then up again, measuring not the man's silence but what it threatened. The tension was too much. He exhaled and muttered more to himself than anyone else, but loud enough to infect the air. I've seen his kind before. Uniform's real. Mind isn't. The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. Their poison worked quietly. There was a beat of stillness, then a bark of laughter from Maddox, short, sharp, and perfectly timed. He thinks he's Patton reincarnated, he said, his voice gleeful with venom. The only thing missing is the cigar and the tanks. That one landed. It cracked the room open. Laughter trickled from the back benches. Not the loud kind, the guilty kind, the kind that begged for cover behind other voices. Even the stenographer let out a breath that could have passed for a stifled chuckle. The judge didn't stop it. He didn't need to. This wasn't about order anymore. It was about dominance. Marcus remained seated, face still carved in stone, as if the noise in the room didn't reach the depth he existed in. But then he moved. Smooth, unhurried, with the confidence of someone who never had to announce their intent. He stood, not defiantly, not dramatically, just necessarily, as if gravity worked differently around him, as if he'd always intended to stand at this moment and no other. His hand reached for the lapel of his coat and gently adjusted it, brushing invisible dust from the thread, smoothing the crease like a man who still believed in order, even when surrounded by mockery. The courtroom tensed. The laughter stopped midstream, like someone had snapped a wire. Marcus took a single step forward, then another, heading toward the defendant's stand. Not rushing, not dragging. There was no clatter, no command, just motion, clean, deliberate, whole. Maddox shifted in his chair, mouth already loading another insult. "What now?" he sneered, eyes tracking Marcus's path. "You gonna read us a poem?" The grin on his face dared Marcus to respond with something soft, something preachy, something he could rip apart. But Marcus didn't flinch. He reached the edge of the stand, paused, glanced downward, and then, only then, spoke. One sentence, one line. "I just didn't want my medals hitting the dirt." It landed like a hammer. The room froze. No one moved, no one blinked. The sentence was soft, calm, almost too polite, and yet it ripped the air open like a gunshot in a church, because it said everything. It wasn't a defense. It wasn't an explanation. It was an indictment. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of realization. That line wasn't about fabric. It wasn't about metal. It was about principle. It was about the insult, not of being called fake, but of being asked to stand among the filth and let that lie hold. And in that one sentence, Marcus didn't just rise above the insult, he buried it. Maddox looked like he wanted to scoff, but something stuck in his throat. He shifted his jaw, tried to smirk, It didn't work. The judge cleared his throat, uncomfortable now, suddenly remembering that robes don't protect against shame. The moment stretched and stretched, tension climbing the walls like heat. And Marcus? He didn't wait for permission. He returned to his seat with the same quiet gravity, no rush, no hesitation, as if the world had reset on his terms. His medals are still intact, his posture was still unbroken, his silence still the loudest thing in the room. The words still hung in the air. Marcus's lone sentence, deceptively soft but surgically placed, when he moved again. Not fast, not slow, just exact. He reached into his inner coat pocket and withdrew a device no larger than a standard government-issued phone. Matte black. No logo, no flair, pure function. The courtroom didn't know how to react. Still digesting what had just happened, when his thumb tapped the glass with the steadiness of someone who wasn't asking for permission. Maddox's voice snapped through the room like a cracked whip. "Not! Put that away. You're not authorized to use personal devices in here." The deputy half rose, pointing with the righteousness of someone used to command, but behind the urgency in his voice was a flicker of unease. His posture wasn't controlled. It was fear camouflaged as regulation, but Marcus didn't even glance in his direction. His eyes were on the screen. The courtroom dimmed slightly as the device lit up in the sterile white glow of high-security interfaces. No apps, no background, just a series of rotating access fields. A soft click echoed as his fingers tapped in a code sequence. 7 digits, then an override prompt, then a confirmation. The screen flashed once, then stabilized. Line 7. Pentagon secure. No one in the room moved. Maddox leaned forward, squinting as if reading it wrong. His voice sharpened. "You think this is a spy movie? What the hell do you think you're doing?" But Marcus remained still, the phone pressed loosely to his ear, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze forward. He wasn't performing, he was executing. The silence that followed was terrifying. Not dramatic silence, but the kind that comes before classified words are spoken. The kind of silence where the wrong breath can echo like a gunshot. Marcus stood in that pocket of quiet like it belonged to him. He spoke, calm, measured, lethal in precision. "Requesting immediate verification of authorization," he said. "Protocol 27 Delta." The line gave nothing back for a moment, then a voice responded. Clear, clipped, female, American accent sharpened by military cadence. 27 Delta received. Stand by for encryption. A low hum filled the room, just barely audible. It wasn't sound, it was implication. On screen, the label changed again. Decryption addicts level. Maddox stepped back involuntarily. "You're not serious," he muttered, but his voice was quieter now. The arrogance thinning. "That's not real. That's just dress-up tech. I've seen crap like that in apps." Marcus said nothing. His lips didn't twitch. His focus remained on the connection, on the process, like the courtroom didn't exist anymore, like he had elevated into a different plane of operation, and in a way, he had. While everyone else sat rooted to their roles, he had reached beyond the walls, beyond the badge, beyond the bench, into a network of power none of them could see, let alone understand. The line came alive again. "Authentication confirmed. Secure line engaged. Please state the request." Marcus's tone didn't change. "Verification of authority active. Channel integrity check for immediate legal override under executive conditions. Repeat, executive." There was no drama. No swelling music, just silence, punctuated by the slow exhale of power moving in unseen directions. "Confirmed," the voice said. "You are now operating under Tier 1 priority. Proceed." Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. He lowered the phone and tapped once more. The screen darkened. The connection terminated. No password prompt, no confirmation, just absolute obedience to his gesture. Maddox opened his mouth, but couldn't find the right level of sarcasm. His eyes bounced between the now dark screen and Marcus's expressionless face. "That's supposed to impress us?" He scoffed, but the bite had drained from his tone. "You get some retired tech friend to spoof a UI? You think that's how you win a case?" Marcus didn't even look at him. He placed the device gently on the table in front of him, not as a trophy, as a warning. The judge shifted, not with irritation, but with discomfort. Something had changed, something fundamental. The room felt different, the air denser, like the rules had quietly rewritten themselves while no one was watching. Someone in the back of the courtroom coughed. It sounded louder than it should have. Maddox tried to rally, his hand tightening around his cup. "Don't buy it," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "He's bluffing, playing tech games. There's no way that was real." But no one responded, not even the bailiff, because deep down they knew. That kind of silence didn't lie. That kind of stillness didn't bluff. It operated. The silence left in the wake of Marcus's call still lingered like the chill of an open vault door. Something had been accessed, something far above the courtroom's reach, and now every person in that room was quietly recalibrating their understanding of where the ground was. The phone rested on the table like a detonator that hadn't gone off yet. Marcus didn't touch it again. He didn't need to. The damage was already spreading, invisible but absolute. Maddox couldn't take it anymore. His authority had been a smirk, a voice, a posture. But now, each second Marcus refused to acknowledge him made that posture look pathetic. He stood up too quickly. His chair scraped against the floor with a screech that sounded desperate. He marched toward the defense table, his voice loud, cruel, straining for control. "Who the hell were you calling, huh?" he snapped, stopping just short of Marcus's shoulder. "Your mother? Your lawyer from Hollywood? What, some ghostwriter for all those medals?" And that was the moment Marcus finally turned his head. No flourish, no fury, just a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes lifting from the table, then rotating toward Maddox, locking in. The kind of look that didn't blink, that didn't ask, that didn't flinch. It wasn't a stare built for intimidation. It was a stare built for truth. Maddox saw it and faltered. Just a blink, a twitch, not enough to call fear, but too much to hide discomfort. Then Marcus spoke. "No," he said. "I called the man you're too scared to say out loud." It was a sentence built like a bullet, short, targeted, fatal. Maddox stepped back without meaning to. The courtroom didn't breathe. It couldn't. Something tectonic had shifted under their feet. That line wasn't a boast. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, delivered in the same calm tone someone might use to announce the time of day. Maddox slammed his hand on the table. A sharp crack. Too loud, too reactive. "You're done," he barked. "That's contempt of court. I could have you cuffed right now." His voice climbed, trying to fill the silence with something, anything, but it only made his panic more obvious. The room wasn't following him anymore. It was following the gravity field of the man who hadn't raised his voice once. The judge leaned forward, mouth half open, brows creased in something unfamiliar. Not confusion, not a command. Something closer to hesitation. He opened his mouth to speak, but never got the chance. "Wait," came a voice, soft, urgent, from the side of the room. Everyone turned. The court officer, young, clipboard in hand, pale as chalk, stepped forward, whispering directly into the ear of the clerk, who leaned into the judge. It wasn't theatrical, it wasn't loud, but the tension in the room made every gesture look monumental. The judge listened, eyes narrowing. He looked at Marcus, then at Maddox, then back to the clerk. Something was cracking behind his gaze, something he hadn't expected. The judge lifted his hand. "Stop," he said. Maddox looked stunned. "Stop? Stop what? This man just—" "I said stop," the judge repeated. His voice was lower now, controlled, a beat slower. "We have incoming personnel from the Department of Defense, en route to this courtroom." The words didn't make sense at first. It was like someone had changed the language mid-conversation. Maddox blinked. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, though the question sounded pathetic. "It means," the judge said, eyes fixed on something none of them could see, "this case just left our jurisdiction." Here it was, the first tremor of the shift. Maddox tried to laugh, but it came out wrong. "You can't be serious. He made a damn phone call." He pulled out a toy and whispered into it. "And now what? You're telling me—" "I'm telling you," the judge said, now looking straight at Maddox, "to sit down." That silenced him, not just because of the words, but because of the way the judge said them. No fire, no bark, just finality. And behind it, something Maddox hadn't felt in years. "Doubt," he said. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just watched the system reorient itself in real time, watched it bend quietly, inevitably, toward something it couldn't delay, and still he hadn't moved. Not really, not yet, but the room had, and it wasn't going back. The echo of the judge's last words hadn't finished bouncing off the walls when the door at the back of the courtroom opened without a knock. No announcement, no protocol, just the slow, deliberate creak of hinges that didn't ask permission. Every head turned. Even the judge froze mid-breath. A man stepped inside. Civilian clothes, dark, immaculate, cut like silence, no expression, no hesitation. On the lapel of his jacket, a 5-pointed gold star gleamed under the courtroom lights. Not decorative, not ceremonial, but functional, like a master key. He didn't pause to scan the room, didn't offer greetings or glances. He walked straight toward the bench with a rhythm that suggested doors opened before he touched them and orders obeyed themselves before he gave them. The leather brief tucked under his arm wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. What mattered was how he set it down. Flat, controlled, final, on the judge's desk. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The judge stared at the folder like it had teeth. His fingers hovered above it, uncertain. Everyone else waited, breaths half-held, movements suspended. Time didn't freeze, but it certainly slowed. Then, predictably, inevitably, Maddox shattered the silence. "Hold up," he barked, rising from his seat as if trying to claw his way back into relevance. "This is my case. I'm still the lead on this. You don't just—" Marcus laughed. It was soft, controlled, a breath of sound that cracked through the room like the surface of glass under pressure. It wasn't joy. It wasn't arrogance. It was recognition. The kind of laugh that said, "You just figured out you were never in control." Maddox turned on him. "You think this is funny?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man in civilian clothes finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every syllable landed like a typed command. "No one is in control of anything in this room. Not anymore." That was it, one sentence, and it rearranged the hierarchy of the entire space. Maddox stood frozen, mouth half open, like someone who'd walked into a room he thought was his and found the locks had changed. "Who the hell even are you?" The man ignored the question. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to justify his presence. He didn't show a badge. The badge was the voice. The authority wasn't spoken. It arrived ahead of him and hovered over everything like an atmospheric change. The judge opened the folder. His hands weren't shaking, but they weren't steady either. One page in, he stopped reading, looked up, met the man's eyes, nodded once. That was all. The man turned, stepped away from the bench, walked slowly across the courtroom, inspecting nothing, commanding everything. He said nothing more, just stood still near the wall as if he had moved the center of gravity in the room with him. The silence was no longer awkward. It was enforced. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, legs planted, hands relaxed. His gaze didn't follow the man. It lifted to the wall behind the judge, where the national emblem hung, motionless, gold and hard. Then it shifted up again, just a few inches, to the old wall clock mounted above it. The second hand ticked forward, one notch, then another. He watched it like a countdown. Maddox, now seated but visibly rattled, hissed to no one in particular. "This is a circus. It's a setup. I don't even know what branch he's from. No chain of command overrides judicial protocol." The man in civilian clothes spoke again, still quiet, still precise. "You don't know a lot of things, deputy." That landed differently, not like an insult, like a diagnosis. Maddox's jaw tightened, but his eyes were retreating. The bravado in his voice couldn't find its way into his spine. "I have procedures. I have jurisdiction. This isn't how things are supposed to work." The man turned toward him, slowly. "That's because this isn't your procedure, and it never was." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. The courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was something else now, a place where hierarchy bent around the weight of a presence that no one could name, and yet no one dared ignore. Marcus didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The order had been issued, and nothing was going back to how it was. The room hadn't moved since the 5-pointed star arrived, and it didn't have time to. The stillness from before hadn't lifted. It had calcified into something denser, heavier, colder. The man in civilian dress didn't speak again. He didn't need to. What he'd set down on the judge's bench was speaking now. The folder had been opened, the page inside had been read, and the effect was immediate, irreversible. The judge's fingers lingered on the paper, but not as a reader, more like a man holding a grenade with no pin. He cleared his throat, then leaned back slightly, as if distance from the document might dull its consequences. But no such distance existed. The courtroom had already changed orbit. A second court officer stepped forward, slower than the first. In his gloved hands was another copy of the document, printed in black and red, official seal gleaming at the top. He moved with the measured care of someone handling a weapon, because in a room like this, that's exactly what it was. He placed it on the prosecution's table, directly in front of Maddox. Maddox didn't touch it, not right away. He stared at it like it might explode, which, in a sense, it already had. Then he reached out, not to read it, not to understand it, but to slap it aside. The paper barely fluttered, but the gesture hit like an outburst. "I don't take orders from the military," he snapped, voice raw, clenched. "This is a civilian court. This is my jurisdiction. You can't just walk in here with a logo and shut everything down." Across the room, Marcus raised his eyes. He hadn't spoken in a while. He didn't need to. But now his voice cut through the air with surgical precision, measured, steady, unblinking. "You don't take orders from the military," Marcus said, "because you never earned the right to." Maddox turned sharply. "You don't get to lecture me." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look directly at him. He was speaking to the air, the truth, the room itself. "You take orders from the country, and the country just revoked yours." The sentence hit like a policy written in stone. "It didn't shout," he pronounced, and the courtroom felt it, not just as sound, but as a consequence. Maddox was already unraveling, but he wasn't done pretending he wasn't. He stood, shoved his chair back violently, and reached into his jacket pocket. What came out was a badge. His badge, still warm from the press of his body, still gleaming with the smug weight of everything he thought it meant. He threw it, hard. It clattered against the judge's desk. Not perfectly, not theatrically, just loud enough to be angry. "I'm done," Maddox growled. "You want to hand over the system to these freaks? Go ahead, but I'm not part of it." No one moved. The badge sat there like a gun left behind at a crime scene. The man in civilian clothes stepped forward. Not fast, not slow, just exactly when he meant to. He didn't look at Maddox. He didn't acknowledge the drama. He picked up the badge, turned it once in his fingers, then handed it, not back to Maddox, but to the judge. His voice was cold steel wrapped in paper. "No one's playing, deputy. This is an order." That was it. No legal code recited, no debate offered, just a shift, so complete it didn't need enforcement. It simply was. Maddox stood still for one breath too long, trying to decide if defiance still had oxygen in this room. It didn't. His authority had been gutted, slowly, then suddenly, and he knew it. His eyes flicked between Marcus and the man from JSOC, searching for purchase, but none existed, only silence, and eyes that were no longer looking up at him, but down. Marcus sat calmly, gaze once again lifted to the courtroom clock, where the second hand had marched forward 5 more ticks. He hadn't stood. He hadn't raised a hand, but the room had moved entirely around him, not in chaos, but in realignment. Control had shifted, not through noise, not through violence, but through the quiet, irreversible stroke of a pen. The badge sat in the judge's hand like a piece of dead currency, its gleam now dull, its weight reduced to symbolism stripped of meaning. Maddox hadn't moved since throwing it. His shoulders heaved once, like breath was no longer automatic, and his eyes darted from face to face, seeking some flicker of validation, some echo of loyalty. He found none. Every person in that courtroom, once silenced by his voice, now looked at him like an artifact of a crumbling era, loud, rusted, and irrelevant. In that silence, it didn't ease, it sharpened. "I'm the sheriff here," Maddox burst out, as if shouting it loud enough might make it real again. "I'm the law in this room. You can't erase that with some document and a bunch of suits from Washington." His voice cracked at the edge, not because it lost strength, but because it had nowhere left to go. He took a step forward, then another, as though sheer movement might reclaim ground that authority no longer covered. "You hear me?" he barked, sweeping a hand toward the gallery. "I'm the one who keeps order here. I'm the one who's kept this town from falling into chaos for 15 goddamn years." No one answered. Marcus stood, slowly, with gravity, not as a threat, not as a challenge, as inevitability. He crossed the space between them with no wasted motion, each step collapsing the illusion that Maddox still stood at the center of anything, and when he arrived, just close enough that the heat of breath might be shared, he didn't raise his voice. He leaned in slightly, his words made of razors and restraint. "You're not the law," Marcus said, calm as stone. "You're the warped reflection of it, bent by fear, propped up by silence." Maddox froze. That close, that quiet, he didn't know what to do. Instinct, old, feral, panicked, moved his hand to his side, his holster, to the gun that had always been his final word in every argument. Only this time, his fingers met nothing. The leather holster was empty, the grip gone. For a split second, the shock on Maddox's face was too raw to hide. His hand hovered there, caught between rage and disbelief, like his own body had betrayed him. And then, from the courtroom entrance, the female voice rang out, clear, clip, carrying the unmistakable calm of someone who didn't need volume to carry authority. "Your weapon has been confiscated under federal security protocol." Every eye turned toward her. She stood at the threshold in a black suit, ID badge visible, hair pinned tightly back, earpiece glowing faintly beneath her collar. Her words were delivered with the neutrality of policy, but the effect was personal, surgical. All unauthorized firearms were secured before entry, for safety, for national jurisdiction. Maddox's mouth opened, nothing came out. He looked around, at the judge, at the clerk, at the bailiff, the people in the gallery who once took their cues from his voice, his badge, and his uniform, and not one of them met his eyes. There was no nod of support, no clearing of the throat, no offer of alliance, only quiet and distance. Marcus took one step back, not in retreat, but in statement. This man had once filled the room. Now he was shrinking inside it. Maddox staggered back half a step, hand still hovering uselessly at his hip, breath now unsteady. "You people think this changes anything?" he said. But the words didn't sound like conviction anymore. They sounded like static. "You think taking my badge and my sidearm makes me powerless? I've still got rank. I've still got a record," but nobody moved, because nobody believed that anymore, and Maddox knew it. He looked down at his empty holster, then around the courtroom like it had betrayed him. Maybe it had. Maybe it had never been his to begin with. And finally, the real fear entered his voice. Not loud, not violent, but shaken, like the foundation had moved beneath him, and no one told him the blueprint had changed. He took another step backward, as if space could protect him now. It couldn't. He wasn't just unarmed. He was alone, and Marcus sat back down, posture unchanged, gaze lifted again to the wall clock that marked every second of unraveling, like a metronome of justice. There was no celebration in his expression, no smirk, no fire, just the presence of a man who had outlasted the shouting and now watched the silence do its work. Because fear once planted doesn't need water to grow. It only needs truth. And in this courtroom, the truth had taken root. The silence that followed Maddox's fall wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, saturated with the weight of something no one could name, but everyone could feel. The courtroom had stopped breathing. The gallery sat frozen, not by violence, not by threat, but by revelation approaching like thunder behind closed glass. And when the screen behind the judge flickered to life, it was as if the entire room turned its head without moving. No one announced the display. It simply began. First, a seal, the Pentagon, clean, unmistakable, then a still image. Marcus, younger, but not by much. Uniform, pristine boots, planted on polished marble floors inside the Pentagon itself. Not a tourist photo, not a pose. It was a still frame, pulled from a live feed, time-stamped, classified header half redacted. Then came the voiceover, flat, official, the kind of narration used in threat assessments and military briefings. Major General Marcus L. Chambers, commander of Black Eagle, classified rapid response unit, operating exclusively under presidential directive, direct line to National Command Authority. No music, no graphics, just the truth. Maddox staggered back as if the words had pushed him. His mouth moved before sound came out. No, that's not possible, he said, but no one was listening to him anymore, not even the air. I didn't know. He turned to the judge, to the audience, to no one in particular. No one told me who he was. There wasn't a file. But Marcus was already standing, not for drama, for history. He took 2 steps forward, slow and absolute, until he was no longer a defendant standing before a judge, but a name, stepping into the light that someone else had tried to bury. You didn't need to know, Marcus said, voice even, eyes never leaving Maddox. But now you do, and now you know the cost of not knowing. It wasn't fury. It wasn't vengeance. It was judgment, not from emotion, but from authority earned, worn, weaponized through control. Maddox opened his mouth again, but the words failed. They stuttered on his lips, tripping over disbelief. Why would someone like you be here, in this courtroom? In front of me. Marcus didn't blink. I'm here because the people who think like you forget who they answer to. It was over. Not the case, not the proceeding. The illusion, the idea that power wore only certain uniforms, spoke only in certain tones, lived only in certain skins. A pin dropped. Someone in the back row exhaled too loudly. The judge hadn't moved since the photo appeared. His fingers had gone still. His eyes were locked on the screen like a man watching something ancient burn. And Marcus, standing under the glow of the emblem behind the bench, turned his eyes upward, past the courtroom, past the robes, past the fall of badges and bravado. He stared straight at the national crest mounted above the judge's seat, its golden wings spread wide, its talons full of arrows, its beak silent, its gaze eternal. And he said, not to the room, but to the symbol itself. And I still stand. The room didn't react, because it couldn't. Because there was nothing left to say when a man no one saw coming rewrote the narrative with nothing but facts, posture, and the unbearable weight of standing taller than the system itself. The courtroom lights buzzed faintly above as the screen flickered to life. The image grainy, but unmistakable. A sealed folder, once marked classified level 4, now lay open on the prosecution table. Its red markings were crossed out with a black stamp that read Declassified, military order. The seal of the Department of Defense shimmered in the corner of each page, making it clear this wasn't tabloid garbage. This was the truth, long buried, now exhumed. Maddox shifted in his seat. The false confidence he had clung to through 10 chapters of this unfolding reckoning began to crack. The silence in the room had weight, and the weight fell hardest on the man who used to laugh the loudest. A woman from the military intelligence unit stood beside the screen, her voice calm, almost surgical. This evidence was retrieved from archived internal communications. It had never been disclosed in prior civilian proceedings due to classification constraints. As of 6:00 hours this morning, it was approved for disclosure under Federal Declassification Protocol 17A. She pressed a button. Audio played. The timestamp blinked on the screen. April 11th, 2012, 3:47, the grainy voice of Maddox came through. He didn't comply, the voice spat. Whatever. These types die early anyway, less weight to carry. Then silence. Static. No protest, no remorse. Just that tone, dismissive, venomously casual, as if talking about trash left on the curb. Marcus didn't move at first. His hands were clasped in front of him, veins taut under the skin, knuckles white. Slowly he stood. The room, already still, seemed to lose even its breath. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The way his eyes locked on the screen, on the audio's origin, said everything. The name had come up in the transcript. Private First Class Jeremiah Cole, 19, black, a combat medic with 0 infractions on record, assigned to Marcus's unit in Kandahar. A quiet kid, quick with his hands, sharp with his eyes, too young to carry trauma, but old enough to die for a flag. Marcus blinked once, a flash of memory, Jeremiah laughing with his boots half untied, arguing about music at the barracks. Another blink, and the laughter was replaced by a photograph, a body, bruised, cold, stamped DOA in custody. Marcus's breath caught, but he didn't let it show. He stepped forward, past the table, past the judge's bench, and into the center of the room. The same room where Maddox had called him a clown, where uniforms had been mocked, where dignity had been stepped on. Now the air had flipped. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a reckoning chamber. Maddox tried to speak. That recording, it was out of context, but his voice sounded tinny, pitiful. The judge didn't even raise a gavel. No one moved. The woman from the intelligence unit simply turned to Marcus and nodded, signaling he had the floor. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point a finger. He just let the silence speak first. Then, finally, his voice came, cold and steady. Jeremiah Cole was under my command. He was my soldier, my responsibility. Another pause, long enough to sting. I was told he died in holding, accidental head trauma, insubordination, they said. They didn't tell me his face was bruised from repeated impact. They didn't tell me it happened in your custody. Maddox opened his mouth again, then closed it. Marcus turned to him, not with anger, but with memory, the kind that burns in silence. You called him these types, said he died early, but he didn't die early. He was killed, slowly, by the kind of rot that wears a badge and pretends to be the law. And for 12 years I carried the weight of not knowing. You called him a burden, but he was my best damn medic. And you were the infection. Murmurs moved through the room like an electric current. The court stenographer's fingers trembled slightly as she typed. Even the thrum of the fluorescent lights felt muted under the tension. Marcus's hand tightened by his side, not from rage, but from grief. Real, raw, unrehearsed grief. He didn't shout, he didn't break, but he looked like a man who had swallowed fire and stood still while it burned. Maddox slouched back in his seat, sweat beginning to bleed through his collar. For years he'd walked free. For years he had wielded sarcasm as a shield, arrogance as a weapon, but neither could protect him from the sound of his voice, damning him from the past. These types die early anyway. The phrase echoed, burned, and clung to the walls like smoke. It wasn't just a slur. It was a sentence, a philosophy, a window into the decay that wore a badge and passed itself off as order. Marcus looked away, back to the judge, then to the rest of the courtroom. I don't stand here for revenge, he said, voice firm but weary. This isn't justice born from rage. This is the weight of truth dropped in a room where it should have been years ago. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photo, worn, bent at the corners. It was Jeremiah, standing on the tarmac, grinning, 2 fingers raised in a peace sign. Marcus placed it gently on the ledge in front of the judge. He didn't get a defense. He didn't get a second chance. But he will be remembered, and the one who laughed as he died will be too. No applause followed, no gasps, just stillness. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full, stuffed with consequence, with the gravity of a story too long silenced. Maddox sat frozen. His skin was pale, his lips were dry, his past had caught up, and it had a voice now, a voice stronger than his mockery, a voice that didn't scream, convicted, all the same. The intelligence officer closed the folder. Her words returned, now razor sharp. The Department of Defense recognizes this incident as a breach of Article 92 and Article 93. Further action pending interagency coordination. Maddox looked around, but found no friendly face, no system to protect him, not anymore. The badge he'd polished, the smirk he'd practiced, the world he'd thought was his, all slipping through his fingers like sand. Marcus didn't sit back down. He remained standing, shoulders squared, eyes focused, not on Maddox, not on the judge, but on the photo, on the boy, on the soldier, on the ghost he hadn't known, still followed him. The grief wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was in the way his breath paused, in the way his fists didn't clench from hate, but from love, bound too long under silence. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited, but inside the real image was being etched, not by lenses, but by memory. The memory of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard, who didn't need vengeance to make the world tremble, who brought the past to the present, not for himself, but for someone who never got to become anything more than 19. And as the judge called for recess, no one stood, no one moved. Because in that moment, justice wasn't a verdict. It wasn't even a sentence. It was the sound of a man finally speaking for the fallen and making sure everyone heard. The judge's gavel had not yet struck, but the courtroom was no longer waiting for its sound. It had become a sanctuary of reckoning, a sealed chamber where truth no longer begged for entry. It demanded it. The air still trembled with the residue of Marcus's voice from the previous moment, a voice that hadn't shouted, but had somehow thundered through every nerve in the room. Maddox was a silhouette now, no longer a man who commanded attention, but a shrinking figure trying to melt into the background, as if invisibility could protect him from consequence. Then, with all the calm of a military formation drill, a second officer from the Department of Defense stepped forward, flanked by two armed marshals in dark uniforms bearing no local insignia. His voice was clipped, precise, and without apology. As of 8:03, per directive from the Secretary of Defense and authorized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an investigation is being opened into Deputy Ryan Maddox under Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The charge: conduct unbecoming, with aggravating intent to defame, discredit, and endanger the integrity of active service personnel and military honor. The room didn't gasp. It recoiled, as though the very foundation of every sarcastic remark Maddox had ever thrown had just been detonated under his feet. Maddox tried to scoff. His voice cracked like a rusted hinge. "You've got the wrong guy. I'm not military. That law doesn't touch me." His words were bitter, desperate, thrown like stones into a hurricane. But there was no wind bending to his side now, no chuckles, no approving nods. The silence had become his enemy. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't tilt his head or lean forward for emphasis. Instead, he walked calmly to the table where the thick manila folder sat, its corners stiff, sealed with an embossed gold clip that shimmered like a sword in waiting. "Do I have any personal requests?" He repeated the question the officer had posed moments ago. His hand reached out, not shaking, not hurried, just one. "Let me read the order myself." He didn't ask, he didn't plead, he took it. The folder was heavy, and not because of the pages it held, but because of what they represented: names, actions, betrayals, and above all, the weight of silence that had protected the unworthy. Marcus stepped forward again, this time to the very front, no barrier between him and the gallery. His back was straight, his voice was low, not because he lacked volume, but because force doesn't always need noise. He opened the folder and began to read, not quickly, not mechanically, but deliberately, each syllable carried like a bullet in slow motion. Subject: Deputy Ryan Maddox. Classification: Federal Civilian Law Enforcement. Allegations: misconduct under UCMJ Article 134. He paused. Subsection: willful disrespect and denigration of uniformed service members. Subsection: unauthorized abuse of influence in collaboration with civilian judicial bodies. Subsection: racially motivated endangerment resulting in preventable death of a subordinate under federal military protection. The words didn't just fall, they stabbed, each one like a blade of glass slicing the thin illusion Maddox had wrapped himself in. A half smirk flickered on Maddox's lips. "I told you," he muttered, looking to the empty seats around him as if searching for an ally. "I'm not a goddamned soldier. That crap doesn't apply. You people are grasping at straws because you don't have a real case." He leaned back with forced ease, but his eyes flickered, betraying the storm behind the glass. Marcus turned toward him slowly. The movement wasn't aggressive, but it was absolute, final, as if the gravity of the courtroom itself shifted with it. His voice was colder than before, not fueled by vengeance, but steadied by purpose. "Wrong," he said, each letter a blade honed with years of silence. "That law applies to anyone who weaponizes authority to soil the uniform of those who earned it. That law applies to anyone who takes blood from those beneath them and treats it like water. That law applies to those who think they stand above it, because that arrogance is the rot we were trained to root out." He stepped closer now, closing the gap not for confrontation, but so Maddox could hear every syllable without the comfort of distance. You weren't a soldier. You weren't a protector. You were a leech, sucking credibility from the uniform you mocked, from the badge you disgraced, from the silence you depended on to hide behind. This law, it was built for that. The last word hung in the air like a cold slap. The judge leaned slightly forward, watching, not intervening. Even the stenographer slowed her keystrokes, caught in the gravity of what was no longer a court session, but a ceremonial dismantling of false power. Marcus looked at the folder again, but he didn't read more. He didn't need to. What remained in that file were technicalities, procedural paths, and bureaucratic architecture. What mattered had already been said. The room knew it. Maddox knew it, and Marcus knew that sometimes the most painful weapon wasn't a raised voice. It was dignity held like a shield and sharpened like a scalpel. Maddox laughed, a hollow, jarring sound that belonged in a cheap bar, not a room charged with reckoning. This is a circus. You all want your hero moment? Fine, take it. Paint me the villain. But I've seen this before. People get angry, they shout, they cry, and then they forget. His tone had that venom again, that sneering contempt that he used to dominate rooms, but now it rang empty, like a sword with no edge. Marcus didn't respond with words this time. He stepped back to his place, turned to face the bench, and placed the folder down as if he were laying down the final piece of evidence, not for judgment, but for history. His hands no longer trembled. His breath was even. He had not come here for Maddox's downfall. He had come to ensure that Jeremiah Cole's memory was written into the record, not as a victim, but as a soldier whose name had been buried beneath a coward's grave. The officer from the Department of Defense nodded once. This matter is now under joint jurisdiction. Federal and military investigators will proceed immediately. Deputy Maddox, your suspension is effective as of now. You are to surrender your credentials and remain under supervised detainment until further notice. Maddox didn't move. The smirk was gone now. Only the hollowness remained. A man out of tricks, stripped of illusion, and facing the quiet weight of truth that had come to collect. No outburst followed, no dragging from the room, just the soft click of a badge being removed and placed on the table, the metallic sound echoing far louder than any scream. The man who once strutted through hallways, coffee in hand and ego in tow, now sat alone, surrounded not by allies, but by the consequences of his design. Marcus watched him for a moment longer, not with satisfaction, but with something colder. Justice, distilled and detached. There was no need for triumph, only closure, only the quiet, crushing sound of a man realizing too late that impunity has an expiration date. And as the court recessed once more, there was no clapping, no shouting, just the heavy awareness that something irreversible had happened, that a reckoning had been read into the record, and that there is, in the end, no room in the code for those who defile the uniform, who spit on the blood of others and expect to walk clean. The silence that followed the removal of Maddox's badge had not dissipated. It lingered like fog in a battlefield, thick and waiting. But it was not the end. It was the beginning of a second front. Because while the courtroom had served as the first arena for truth, the battlefield now stretched beyond its walls, into the corridors of power, the pipelines of media, and the underbelly of a system that had, for too long, pretended not to see. Marcus Chambers stood not as a lone figure anymore, but as the axis around which the narrative began to pivot, and the nation, long indifferent, was now being forced to look at itself. The footage surfaced at dawn. It hadn't come from military archives or a whistleblower in uniform, but from a buried folder on a private server, one that someone, somewhere, had kept out of reach until the right storm arrived. It showed Maddox, in full uniform, planting a weapon beside the body of a restrained suspect. Then another clip, him ordering an officer to tamper with timestamps on dashboard cams. Then another, perhaps the most damning, of Maddox standing over a bloodied teenager in handcuffs, whispering, "Make this one look like self-defense. No one gives a damn if they've got a record." It wasn't just misconduct. It was fabrication, corruption, and desecration of law dressed as law enforcement. Within hours, the video, stitched together from various sources, was verified by independent analysts and aired by multiple national networks. But the explosion didn't happen because of the footage alone. It erupted because of what Marcus did next. He was invited to speak on a primetime news broadcast, live, unedited. The host, known for handling national security analysts and retired generals, introduced him with reverence, but Marcus cut straight through the polish. He didn't fumble for words or sidestep the minefield. He leaned forward, eyes calm, voice locked in steel, and said, "Everyone's asking why he did it. That's the wrong question. The question is, why was he allowed to do it for 12 years? It was not a punch. It was a surgical strike, delivered with the efficiency of a man trained to dismantle systems with minimal casualties. The nation reacted like a struck nerve. Hashtags ignited, phones in state houses lit up, commentators stumbled trying to shift blame, deflect, and contain, but they were already behind, because that sentence, so simple, so merciless in its accuracy, had burned its way into the conscience of a country that had been too willing to close its eyes. Marcus didn't rage, didn't accuse wildly. He simply exposed the fact that Maddox was never a rogue actor. He was a tolerated symptom of a larger disease, an infection fed by silence and bureaucracy. Within 48 hours, the Attorney General of the state issued a formal statement, not in response to pressure, but out of obligation. "We are launching an independent audit into judicial practices across multiple counties in light of compelling evidence indicating long-term abuse of authority," she said. The subtext was clear. Maddox was the fuse, but the bomb was always systemic. Marcus watched the press conference from a chair in the green room of a satellite studio. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh in relief. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence this time wasn't restrained. It was a strategy. He stepped onto a different broadcast the following day, this one with less pretense, more grit. A journalist known for asking questions with knives in them tried to corner him. "Why didn't you demand a full investigation? You had the platform. You had the rage." Marcus leaned forward again, his voice quieter this time, but even more loaded. "I don't want an investigation because I asked for it. I want one because now they can't avoid it." The camera caught the faint shift in his posture, the way a soldier might prepare before entering hostile territory. Controlled, but lethal. By now, congressional representatives were tweeting statements of concern, governors were calling for emergency oversight panels, and the Department of Justice was announcing coordination with state investigators. But Marcus didn't celebrate, because he knew this wasn't a victory parade. It was a forced march through the terrain of responsibility. For every cheer, 100 closed doors were being reluctantly pried open. Maddox, meanwhile, had become a ghost. Once cocky, brash, untouchable, he now existed as headlines, as a cautionary tale, as silence. His defenders evaporated like fog at noon. Even the sheriff's office that had once promoted him without question now issued a statement labeling his actions as deeply troubling and misaligned with our values. It was damage control, pathetic and overdue, and Marcus didn't even bother acknowledging it. What he did acknowledge, publicly, deliberately, was the families, not just of Jeremiah Cole, but of every name that had surfaced in the investigation. At a vigil organized by local veterans, he stood in front of a plain podium in an open-air field, no teleprompter, no lighting crew, and said, "There are some wounds that medals don't cover. There are silences we mistook for peace. But now, the silence speaks, and the wounds are screaming names that can't be ignored anymore." That quote headlined 3 national dailies. But the bigger shift wasn't in newsrooms. It was in the legislature. A bipartisan group of lawmakers moved to initiate a full audit of officer conduct complaints in all counties where Maddox had served. It was no longer about one man. It had become about the rot he represented, and the systems that had fed it, sheltered it, and passed it off as justice. Marcus was asked again and again to endorse these movements, to lead the reforms, to lend his name to bills, initiatives, and task forces. He declined, but every time he declined, he did so with a sentence that left no room for confusion. "I'm not here to cleanse your conscience. I'm here to make sure you don't forget who you enabled." It wasn't vengeance, it was accountability with no sugarcoat. And that was what made it terrifying, because he didn't just indict Maddox, he indicated comfort. He indicted the machinery of normalization, the quiet nods, the shuffled papers, the not my problem attitudes that had allowed a man like Maddox to mold himself into something dangerous under the illusion of duty. In one of his final public appearances that week, Marcus sat down with a university panel on ethics and public service. He wore no medals, just a dark civilian suit. A student asked him, "What would you say to the people who looked away?" Marcus didn't blink. "I don't need to say anything," he answered. "They already hear it every night when they close their eyes." That night, the clip was played not just on news broadcasts, but on TikTok, Reddit, and every platform where conscience could find oxygen. A man who had once been forced to stand silent in a courtroom was now orchestrating a symphony of truth, and every note struck a nerve that systems had numbed for far too long. The dust from the storm Marcus had unleashed hadn't even settled before new tremors shook the foundation deeper. What began as a single man's reckoning had become a rupture across every level of power that had once held Maddox upright. The system that had shielded him now began to expose the true price of blind protection, and the first cracks appeared not on his badge, but on the nameplate outside his front door. It started quietly, as these things often do. A short segment aired late night. Local news, soft-spoken, almost routine. New findings from the Office of the Inspector General suggest irregularities in municipal fund allocations managed by Elise Maddox, wife of former Deputy Ryan Maddox. The anchor's voice didn't waver, but the headline beneath said it all. Embezzlement under review, Maddox household under scrutiny. Within days, what was once speculation became fire. Elise Maddox, a public liaison officer for a mid-sized urban revitalization nonprofit, was found to have rerouted grant funds through a shadowed consultancy that conveniently folded the moment the news broke. The numbers weren't just off, they were predatory. Monies marked for minority housing initiatives were redirected into administrative loopholes, dead-end development contracts, and inflated reimbursements with no receipts. And when reporters dug further, the signatures on several disbursement forms weren't hers, they were her husband's. The lines between criminality and conspiracy were blurred beyond defense. And the thread didn't stop there. An anonymous leak to a collegiate admissions watchdog exposed the oldest son of the Maddox family, Tyler Maddox, recipient of a prestigious state university leadership scholarship. He'd never met the GPA threshold. He'd never completed the community service hours. But he had something else, a letter of recommendation from the sheriff's office, co-signed by 2 now suspended city officials and 1 anonymous donor listed simply as R. The university revoked the scholarship. The student withdrew before the press could reach the dorms. And just like that, the facade cracked. The image Maddox had curated, law enforcer, family man, protector, crumbled into a web of convenience, misuse, and manipulation. One by one, the illusions that had held him aloft began to drop like dead weight, and the nation, still reeling from the courtroom revelations, watched not with sympathy, but with grim recognition. They weren't watching a man fall. They were watching a false legacy implode. Marcus, despite being at the center of it all, remained strangely absent from the media frenzy. No statements, no interviews, no book deals, no sound bites. When approached by a high-profile reporter outside a military advisory council meeting and asked directly, "Did you intend to bring down his entire family?" Marcus didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I never touched them." The truth did that. Then he walked away, clean-cut, unshaken, leaving the weight of those 6 words to do what commentary never could: bury speculation beneath moral precision. It was a statement that sliced sharper than any accusation. Because of its simplicity, it shattered the myth of revenge. Marcus was not a man on a vendetta. He was gravity. And Maddox's world, propped up by fiction and fraud, was always destined to collapse the second reality touched it. Commentators tried to frame it differently. Some accused Marcus of orchestrating a takedown. Others tried to reframe the narrative as a personal crusade gone too far. But those voices didn't last long, because what followed wasn't a scandal. It was accountability, unfiltered, and the public, perhaps for the first time in years, saw the difference. Maddox defenders, once vocal, smug, and loud, fell silent, unable to deny the chain reaction that had nothing to do with military tribunals or political campaigns. It wasn't a man with a grudge pulling strings. It was a man standing still while the lies around him collapsed under their decay. The Department of Justice quietly launched a secondary probe into the Maddox family's finances. No press conference, no podium. Just subpoenas, sealed warrants, and IRS cross-checks. Elise Maddox was placed on unpaid leave. Her legal counsel resigned mid-case. Tyler was no longer attending classes. And Ryan Maddox, once the predator, now sat alone in a pre-trial holding facility, stripped of title, weapon, and reputation, watching the fallout not with disbelief, but with a slow, dawning terror that nothing was going to stop the spiral. Marcus received a message, an email forwarded from an internal affairs officer. It contained a short transcript from Maddox's last supervised phone call to his wife. The tone was desperate, broken. Maddox had whispered, "They're turning everything we built into rubble." Elise's response was quiet, sharp. "No, you did that the second you thought no one was watching." Marcus didn't reply to the message. He simply deleted it, closed the laptop, and moved on. Because none of this was about victory. It was about exposure. And exposure was a force indifferent to ego, equally lethal to the innocent and the complicit. At a press conference days later, a journalist tried one last angle. "General Chambers, how do you feel about the Maddox family suffering for the sins of one man?" The room hushed. Flashbulbs waited. Marcus's eyes narrowed just slightly, not with anger but with disbelief at the question's laziness. He stepped to the podium, unhurried, shoulders square. "Suffering is when you're punished for something you didn't choose. They didn't suffer. They benefited. For years, from every silence, every bypassed rule, every lie is co-signed with a smile. Now the truth has simply presented the invoice, and they can't afford it." The room didn't erupt. It froze, because what he delivered wasn't outrage. It was balanced, cold, cutting balance. A reminder that justice isn't always about prison bars or public apologies. Sometimes it's just the slow unmasking of everything that was never real. And that's what made it unbearable for Maddox. He could have handled prison. He could have handled outrage. But what he couldn't handle? What stripped him bare was watching his empire of pretenses become unsalvageable, piece by piece, while the man he tried to humiliate didn't lift a finger to stop it. Marcus wasn't pushing, he was simply present. And presence, backed by truth, was more devastating than any retribution campaign. Back in his modest office at the Veterans Advocacy Council, Marcus hung a single photograph, a black and white image of a courtroom, empty chairs, an empty judge's bench, a flag in the background. When asked what it meant, he replied, "It's what power looks like before the people arrive." Then he turned away, back to the work, back to building what had been neglected. He never once mentioned Maddox's name again in public, because the final blow wasn't a scandal or a headline, it was erasure, and that, perhaps, was the only true justice for men who built themselves on strings, pretending to be steel. Truth, once unleashed, doesn't sleep. It lingers, travels, mutates, and eventually finds its shape in the most unexpected places. While the collapse of the Maddox facade had left the air thick with silence, a deeper echo had begun to rise, not from courtrooms, not from legislative halls, but from the forgotten depths of paper archives and buried drafts. It was in those pages, crinkled and yellowed by time and rejection, that a new storm began. One Marcus Chambers hadn't planned, authored, or anticipated, but which now carried his voice farther than any broadcast ever could. It started with a call to the editorial office of The Atlantic. A junior staffer on a rotation through their military history desk had been doing routine archival scans when he stumbled across a reference from a defunct Army-based newsletter dated 2006. The note mentioned a restricted opinion column by a junior officer stationed in Iraq that had been rejected by both military public affairs and local civilian outlets. The name attached to it, Marcus L. Chambers. What followed was a cascade of curiosity, then obsession. Within hours, the article was unearthed, authenticated, and submitted for editorial review. By dawn, it was live, unabridged, uncensored, and on the front page. The title was blunt, "When Silence Wears a Uniform." The subtitle whispered with quiet defiance, "An officer's confession from a battlefield that never made it to the news." The words inside burned, not with anger, but with precision. Not everyone who wears the uniform understands the weight it carries, Marcus had written almost 2 decades prior. Some carry it like armor, others like costumes, but if you wear it and say nothing when you witness the abuse of that trust, then the insignia on your chest is just decoration, no more sacred than a pin on a birthday sash. It wasn't written for applause. It was written because someone had to say it, and at the time no one else dared. Now, the world was listening, not because Marcus had changed, but because the world had finally caught up to what he'd seen all along. The article tore through military circles like a missile, not because it accused, but because it resonated. Veterans reposted it. Active service members quoted it in private forums and base canteens. It didn't call anyone out by name, but it called everyone in by conscience. The power of it lay not in spectacle, but in introspection. It forced readers to look inward, to measure themselves not against their titles, but against their silence. And for the first time, the public response wasn't fueled by outrage, it was driven by reverence. People began showing up outside municipal buildings and court steps, not with protest signs, but with printed copies of the article, folded in their hands like quiet weapons. One man stood in front of a state courthouse with nothing but a photo of Marcus clipped to a board, and below it a handwritten sign, "He stood for someone. Who do you stand for?" That image went viral, not because of volume, but because of gravity. It didn't shout, it asked. Marcus, upon hearing the article had been published, didn't react with shock or pride. He simply nodded once. When asked by a former aide whether he wanted to release a statement, he responded, "I already did, 18 years ago." Then he folded the newspaper and went back to reviewing legislative amendments for a military oversight committee. The shift was palpable. Media outlets began running retrospectives on other stories that had once been buried, cut short, or manipulated by narrative control. Chambers's article became the benchmark, the catalyst used to measure how long institutions had been ignoring their rot. And through it all, Marcus remained silent, a fixed point in a world suddenly spinning to catch up with the stillness he'd embodied for years. Critics tried to twist it. Some said the piece was self-righteous. Others tried to discredit its age. But none could deny its power, because the timing was no accident. The truth doesn't age, it waits. And when the climate becomes hot enough, it ignites. A particularly venomous commentator on a political talk show sneered, "It's just words. No medals were won writing essays in Iraq." The clip circulated, and the backlash was instant. Not from Marcus, not from any organized campaign, but from a groundswell of readers who had, for too long, been waiting for language that matched what they'd felt but couldn't express. "Words," one viral tweet replied, "are how wars end, and cowards always fear the last sentence." Outside the courthouse, where it all began, someone set up a chalkboard with a daily quote from Marcus's article. Soldiers, civilians, students, they took photos. They added their own stories beneath the quotes, creating a living wall of testimony. The site became a memorial, not for death, but for dignity, not to mourn what had been lost, but to celebrate what was finally being acknowledged. Marcus passed by it once, unannounced, unguarded. Someone recognized him. A woman, mid-30s, stood with a coffee in one hand and the article in the other. She didn't ask for a photo. She simply said, "Thank you for saying it when no one else would." Marcus nodded. No handshake, no performance, just that same restrained gravity that had come to define him. Not a man performing virtue, but a man embodying it. Meanwhile, Maddox's name had vanished from headlines, replaced by institutional autopsies and policy audits. The nation had stopped looking at the man and started looking at the system, and in doing so, it found itself face to face with the uncomfortable truth that it had never needed villains in masks. It had needed mirrors. Marcus's article wasn't a condemnation. It was a diagnosis. And now the patient, the country, had no choice but to respond. Academics began assigning the piece in ethics courses. Junior officers cited it in their leadership journals. Political theorists debated its implications for military-civilian dynamics. And through it all, Marcus remained exactly who he had always been. Not a loud hero, not a passive victim, but something harder to define and infinitely harder to dismiss. A man who dared to speak truth before it was convenient. And perhaps that, more than any trial, more than any televised collapse, was the true reckoning, that the words once deemed too dangerous to publish had now become the blueprint for accountability. Because some legacies are earned in silence, then heard in echoes. And Marcus Chambers's echo was now being read on breakfast tables, discussed in classrooms, whispered between cadets, and etched into a national conscience that would never again be able to pretend it hadn't seen. The article had done what no trial, no press conference, no indictment could. It seeped into the bloodstream of the country, rewiring how people spoke about power, about uniforms, about the silence that often followed abuse. It didn't ignite outrage, it matured it, distilled it, and redirected it. The ripple became a wave, and the wave a policy. State legislators, some moved by conscience, others by calculation, introduced a bill within days. The text was short, unpretentious, but it carried the weight of history behind every clause. Its name was simple, the Chambers Act, but its implications were seismic. Under its provisions, any public servant who had received 3 or more formal complaints over the span of their career would be subject to automatic federal review, regardless of prior internal outcome. No appeals, no local shielding. The system would finally turn its lens inward, and the law would no longer rely on the myth of self-policing. Debate in the chamber was fierce. Some decried it as federal overreach. Others claimed it would destroy careers built on good intentions misread. But the votes came down not on ideology, but on timing. No one wanted to be on record standing in the way of accountability, especially now, especially after the world had read Marcus's words and seen with painful clarity where the absence of scrutiny had led. The bill passed. The governor signed it in a televised ceremony, the kind typically reserved for landmark education or infrastructure reforms. But this one was different. There were no brass bands, no swelling anthems, just a signature, a pen laid down, and a podium microphone picking up the faint scratch of the final letter drawn. Reporters turned toward the crowd, cameras scanning for Marcus. He wasn't there. A staffer from the governor's office confirmed what few already suspected. He had declined the invitation. No speech, no handshake, no staged photo. When pressed, the aide said Marcus's exact words were, "My name doesn't need to be on the paper. It's already on the forehead of every man who had to bow their head because no one stopped it sooner." And that quote, far from diminishing the law, immortalized it. Headlines didn't read, "Governor signs new law." They read, "He stood so no one else had to kneel again." Meanwhile, the hammer finally fell on Ryan Maddox. With the Chambers Act now in effect, his record, previously seen as a mosaic of isolated incidents, was formally reevaluated by a federal oversight panel. The number of complaints against him? 7. 3 of them had been dismissed due to insufficient documentation. 2 were buried in procedural delays. The last 2? Lost, mysteriously, until now. The moment the count hit 3, the law clicked into motion like a rifle's bolt sliding forward. This time, there would be no procedural delays, no backdoor phone calls, no shield of local favors. Maddox was officially charged with felony misconduct, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under color of law. His attorney, once a courtroom regular, often flamboyant in style and immunity arguments, quietly withdrew from the case. No firm would step in. No lawyer wanted their name associated with defending a man now synonymous with systemic decay. The irony was poetic. The man who had once relished his public platform, who had called courtrooms his playground and microphones his stage, now sat voiceless in pre-trial custody. The only sound around him, the occasional buzz of a flickering hallway light, and the quiet clicks of keys typing up the charges that no one would dare suppress. And Marcus? He didn't gloat. He didn't watch the news. When told Maddox was being formally prosecuted and no counsel had stepped up, he simply replied, "Then the truth will have no one left to argue against." It wasn't a boast, it was a statement of equilibrium. He understood something most people never grasp until too late, that justice isn't about applause, it's about removal. Quiet, methodical, irreversible removal of what no longer belongs. He had become, by now, a reluctant icon. His name, though left off the law, had been carved into public memory. People referenced the chamber's standard in panel discussions and law reviews. Pundits on opposing sides debated what it meant for future oversight. But Marcus remained still, always still, not frozen, but composed, like a statue built not of stone but of iron under pressure, immovable but not unreachable. In an unannounced visit to a military ethics seminar, he entered the room without introduction. No press, no entourage. He sat in the back, listened, and left one sentence before the end. But before exiting, he left behind a handwritten note on the podium. It read, "You don't need a new oath. You need to remember why the old one mattered." That single sentence went on to be published in the U.S. Army Officer Candidate Handbook's new edition the following year. Meanwhile, the implications of the Chambers Act spread like wildfire. Counties across the country reopened dormant files. Internal affairs divisions were restructured. Whistleblower protections were extended. For the first time in a generation, fear stopped flowing downward. It began flowing upward, into the offices of those who had built careers on concealment. Maddox's indictment was never about spectacle. It was the capstone of something larger, the full loop of accountability finally snapping shut. He had believed, for years, that procedure was immunity, that status was shelter. But the Chambers Act turned those shields into magnifying glasses, and the more he was examined, the more the rot beneath the badge was exposed. When his arraignment was televised, viewership barely cracked 1 million. The public had already moved on, not from the pursuit of justice, but from the man who had mistaken himself as untouchable. He wasn't a threat anymore, he was a warning. Marcus declined to comment. He didn't attend. He didn't issue a statement, because this was no longer about him. It never had been, and that, more than any headline, was why his silence continued to echo louder than any defense Maddox had ever stammered from behind a podium. The story was complete, not because the book had ended, but because the country had finally learned how to turn the page. The law had passed, the trial had begun, the nation had shifted, and through it all, Marcus remained the same, silent, steady, immovable, not because he lacked more to say, but because he understood that some statements should not be spoken, they should be lived. The world was now orbiting a new truth, one forged not in front of microphones, but in the unrelenting gaze of a man who had already paid the cost of clarity. Yet amidst the whirlwind of reforms and reckonings, there remained one final chapter only Marcus could write, and it would not be delivered through policy, courtrooms, or speeches. He arrived at Arlington alone. No motorcade, no reporters, no ceremonial wreaths. He wore a plain black coat over a dark suit, the medals stripped from his chest, the weight of rank left behind. In his hand, not a folded flag or bouquet, but something far quieter, far heavier, a single insignia, polished, encased in a velvet box. It was his, earned, not awarded, worn through sandstorms, sweat, and the long nights of command. And now it had one final destination. The headstone stood simple, white, unadorned. The inscription read, Jeremiah Cole, PFC, U.S. Army, beloved son, 199222012. No rank above his name, no testament below, just a line of grass, a silence that stretched like sky, and a memory Marcus had carried like a scar under every uniform since he knelt. not in weakness, but in acknowledgement. The air didn't move. There was no breeze to dramatize the moment, no birds to break the stillness, just the faint crunch of gravel underfoot as a guard patrolled 2 rows behind, respectfully distant but watchful. Marcus opened the box, removed the insignia with both hands, and placed it carefully on the base of the stone. It gleamed, not like decoration, but like judgment, a final statement made not with ink, not with fire, but with absence, the kind of absence that demands recognition without needing sound. He didn't speak, not to Jeremiah, not to himself. Words would have felt like trespass. He had said all he needed to all who deserved it, but here, in the company of one who never had the chance to finish his story, Marcus chose silence, not as retreat, but as reverence. He stood, slowly, knees stiff from years of command, back straight from decades of burden. He glanced once more at the insignia, now resting like a seal upon the grave, and turned without ceremony. His steps were measured, even, and unguarded. As he left, he didn't look back, because some goodbyes are too sacred for second glances. The cameras didn't catch it, but the security footage did. A single frame from a mounted security camera showed Marcus kneeling beside the grave, hand resting gently on the stone, the box empty beside him. The guard, off-frame, later admitted he didn't intend to release it, but he did, and he did it not out of defiance, but duty. The clip went viral within hours, not because it was polished, but because it wasn't. Grainy, still, no sound, no filter, just a man kneeling before a grave and leaving behind the only thing he had ever worn that didn't weigh him down. The internet labeled it the salute without applause, but one phrase stuck harder than all the rest. He didn't need to perform to be remembered. That sentence carved itself into the culture like scripture. It appeared on murals, carved into the sides of public monuments, whispered in classrooms. Soldiers printed it on the inside of their jackets. Protesters painted it across homemade signs. And for once, the world had a hero who didn't ask for the stage. He simply showed them how to build one out of principle and walk off it quietly. There were no press briefings. Marcus never commented. He was seen boarding a train back to D.C. the next morning, coat buttoned, eyes forward, a man finished with one war and preparing quietly for the next. What no one saw was what he left behind. The badge was not just an emblem. It was a declaration, placed not in anger, not in grief, but in truth. It said that Jeremiah had earned more than his memory. He had earned a legacy. And Marcus, with all his rank, all his scars, all his iron will, had chosen to lay his symbols at the feet of a soldier denied his time. It was not forgiveness. It was a restoration. No institution had ordered it. No bill had required it, and that's why it mattered, because it was the clearest signal yet that the story, once about justice and reform, had moved somewhere deeper, toward atonement, toward conscience, toward something that couldn't be voted on or written into law. It had become personal, national, human, and in that quiet, grassy plot at Arlington, beneath an overcast sky and fading footsteps, the country found something it hadn't expected to: peace. Not the kind bought with treaties or won with weapons, but the kind born from finally facing what had been ignored and bowing, not in shame but in solemn understanding, because that's where real change begins. Not in speeches, not in applause, not in vengeance, but in a quiet kneel before what we failed and the will to stand up differently. He had left the badge on the grave, but the gravity of what Marcus Chambers represented only deepened. His silence had become an institution in itself, a presence too loud to ignore, too composed to distort. Yet even silence, when carried too long, becomes a weight, and the weight of his truth was now being summoned into the one place where power still dressed itself in performance, the State House of Representatives. The invitation was formal, diplomatic, and, above all, strategic, worded carefully as an opportunity for symbolic reflection. The State House had extended Marcus a speaking slot before their annual Justice Oversight session. The organizers were hoping for optics, a clean close to a season of embarrassment. What they didn't understand was that Marcus never played the optics game. He didn't speak for the cameras. He spoke when it was necessary. And when he did, truth didn't come in paragraphs. It arrived like a scalpel. He walked in without a folder, no notes, no briefing, just a tailored gray suit and eyes that didn't scan for approval. The room was packed, representatives shoulder to shoulder, aides along the aisles, media in the upper gallery, pens poised like blades. As he stepped to the podium, even the light seemed to lean closer. Expectant, the same men and women who had drafted, debated, and passed the Chambers Act now sat with expressions balanced uneasily between reverence and fear, because Marcus had never asked for their permission, and yet here they were, waiting for his verdict. He took exactly 2 seconds to settle, not out of nerves, but so the weight of his presence could land. And then he spoke. "I don't want the system to apologize to me," Marcus said, his voice unflinching, devoid of affect, colder than indictment. "I want it to apologize to the people who never got the chance to speak." That was it. He didn't elaborate. He didn't grandstand. He didn't tell them what to do or how to do it, because he understood something they didn't. You don't need to shout into a microphone when the building itself already knows it's guilty. The silence afterward was nuclear. Not awkward, not theatrical, just absolute. A silence that wasn't waiting to be filled, but rather exposed everything inside it. There was no clapping, not at first, no standing ovation. The House chamber, for once, looked like what it was, not a theater of power, but a courtroom of complicity. For a moment, no one knew where to put their hands, or their eyes, or their guilt, and then, slowly, they rose. Not because Marcus had told them to, not because he inspired them, but because they didn't know what else to do with themselves in the face of a truth that was too sharp to ignore and too late to undo. One by one, they stood, stiffly, awkwardly, as if trying to decide whether they were honoring him or surrendering to something heavier. The cameras captured it all, but the footage didn't go viral for its imagery. It went viral because of what wasn't said, because of the expression on each face. That was the story. That was the moment the institution, in all its polished denial, had to swallow its reflection. No spin, no filter, no narrative gymnastics, just the raw truth that every single person in that room had known, at some point, about someone like Maddox, and chose silence. Marcus didn't stay to bask in their discomfort. He stepped away from the podium, turned and walked out without glancing back. No handshakes, no nods, not even eye contact. He had come for one reason, to return the question to its rightful owners, and now it sat on their desks, unwrapped and unignorable. In the hours that followed, every major outlet aired the clip. It played between debates, broke through pundit panels, and interrupted primetime commercials, not because it was explosive, but because it was unanswerable. Every headline echoed the same line. He didn't ask for justice, he asked for remembrance. Political analysts tried to dissect it. Some called it minimalist rhetoric, others labeled it ethical disruption, but none could deny the effect. Committee chairs began quietly reopening reviews. Subcommittees initiated post-audit debriefs. Whistleblower protections were extended retroactively. It wasn't a policy change. It was a moral aftermath. And still, Marcus refused to comment. When a journalist approached him outside a veterans' mental health fundraiser and asked what he hoped legislators would take from his words, he didn't even slow his step. Nothing. They have already took too much. Now it's their turn to return something. The quote trended for 2 days straight, not because it was provocative, but because it was undeniable. Back inside the State House, the echo of that one sentence still hadn't faded. Lawmakers, some of whom had survived decades without ever being held accountable for whom they ignored, found themselves caught in a storm that couldn't be weathered with press releases. Because what Marcus had said wasn't political, it was ethical. And ethics, once breached, don't heal on their own, they scar. Maddox's name was never mentioned during the session, not once. He had become irrelevant, a case number, a lesson. What mattered now wasn't his punishment, it was the realization that the system had known and had allowed him to persist anyway. Marcus hadn't needed to point fingers, he just pulled the curtain back, and there, behind the illusion, stood every man and woman who had called silence due process, who had stamped denial as lack of evidence, who had convinced themselves that being in the room was enough. Marcus had told them otherwise. With one line, he had made it clear, you're not righteous for surviving a system, you're only righteous if you refuse to let it eat someone else alive. That, ultimately, was what shattered the room. Because every lawmaker who stood that day didn't rise out of solidarity. They rose out of self-recognition. They stood because sitting would have meant staying the same, and in the presence of Marcus Chambers, no one could afford to remain who they were. The halls that once trembled under Marcus Chambers' silence had quieted again, not out of peace, but because the echo had landed. Power had shifted. The law had changed. The nation, now breathless in the shadow of what had been revealed, needed one last image, not of justice, but of consequence. That image wouldn't come from a hero standing tall, but from a man who had once laughed too loudly, now sitting in a cell where even breathing seemed like too much noise. Ryan Maddox, once the face of smug authority, now wore a jumpsuit the color of dull clay, matching the concrete walls he could no longer strut past. The light in the interview room was industrial and sterile, flickering slightly as if the fixture itself resisted illuminating him. He sat on a metal chair bolted to the floor, hands folded, fingers twitching. He didn't look beaten, he looked erased, like someone who'd once played God with people's dignity, now trying to remember if he'd ever had his own. Across from him sat a journalist, mid-30s, not from the networks that once gave Maddox airtime to gloat. This reporter wasn't interested in spin. She was there for the raw, the ruin, the reckoning. Her voice was neutral, her notepad unopened. She only had one question prepared. The camera crew checked the frame. The red light blinked on. She leaned forward just slightly, enough to close the air between them without giving him warmth. "Mr. Maddox," she said calmly, not even calling him deputy anymore, "what goes through your mind when you remember that the man you mocked, publicly, repeatedly, turned out to be a major general in the United States Army?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Maddox didn't lift his head. His mouth twitched once, like a reflex. His hands, once symbols of control, gripped each other too tightly. For years, he'd used words like whips, sarcasm like steel. Now, all of it had rusted in his throat. He looked up, not at her, not at the camera, but somewhere past it, as if hoping someone else would answer for him. But no one did. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. His eyes drifted downward. Not in shame, he hadn't earned that yet, but in recognition. This was the first time in his life that silence didn't protect him. It exposed him, because now the silence was louder than any insult he had ever thrown. The reporter didn't push. She didn't fill the space. She didn't reframe the question. Because some questions aren't meant to spark debate. They're meant to hollow you out. Behind the camera, the sound technician stopped adjusting the audio levels. Even the guards at the door had gone still. The room held its breath, watching a man who had once commanded chaos, now drowning in the quiet he used to weaponize. The cameraman, still filming, slowly zoomed in, not for drama, but for honesty. Maddox sat there, motionless. His mouth remained closed. His eyes stayed on the floor. The light above buzzed once. He blinked. That was the only movement. And then, after a full minute of dead air, the reporter stood. She looked at the cameraman and nodded. The red light went off. The silence still lingered, though now it belonged only to him. As they began packing the equipment, the youngest crew member, barely out of film school, quiet all day, whispered the line that would become the title heard around the world. "We don't need another shot." His silence is the footage. When the segment aired, it wasn't slotted into prime-time drama. It was uploaded as a 5-minute uncut clip. No intro music, no post-production, no voiceover. Just one question, one man, one room, and a stillness that felt like judgment. Within hours, it became the most shared political clip of the year. The comment section wasn't filled with jokes or anger. It was a mausoleum of collective realization. Users posted timestamps of Maddox blinking. Others broke down his body language like archaeologists analyzing a ruin. But no one needed subtitles. The title said it all. The Man Who Laughed, Now Too Quiet to Breathe. Critics tried to say it was staged, that he was coached into silence. But those voices evaporated quickly, because the clip didn't function like a gotcha moment. It wasn't justice porn. It was something else. The collapse of a man whose entire identity had been built on never being silent, now crumbling because silence was all he had left. And it wasn't just Maddox who was watching. Retired officers played the video at ethics briefings. Civilian oversight boards played it in training sessions. A federal judge quoted it during a sentencing hearing for another corrupt official, stating, "Let this serve as precedent. When the system no longer defends you, your silence is your only sentence." And Marcus? He watched the clip once, alone, in a small advisory room before a meeting with state-level prosecutors on unrelated cases. He didn't pause, he didn't rewind, he didn't smile. He just sat with it for the full 5 minutes, then turned off the screen. When asked later by a fellow advisor what he thought of the footage, Marcus replied simply, "It's not the sound of defeat, it's the sound of emptiness, finally echoing." Maddox didn't give another interview. He refused all correspondence. He didn't write a memoir or issue a statement, because you can't write from a place that's already hollow. His voice, once a weapon, now served only as a reminder of how many people had paid for his noise, and his silence, now public, permanent, became his legacy, not by erasure, but by exposure. No guards saluted him, no fellow inmates followed him, no apology came from his mouth, and that, in the end, was the loudest admission of all. The silence that had hollowed Maddox's legacy now lingered in the national psyche, not as absence, but as space, finally cleared for meaning. No more spin, no more courtroom theater, no more empty uniforms hiding cowardice. What followed wasn't just policy or punishment, it was reflection. Deep, collective, uncomfortable reflection. And in the center of it all, Marcus Chambers had become something more than a man. He had become measure. So when he agreed, months later, to appear at the swearing-in ceremony for a new generation of military recruits, it wasn't framed as a public event. It was framed as a moment, one that didn't require music, salutes, or media invitations, just presence. Just wait, just the awareness that sometimes the quietest gestures are the ones that recalibrate the entire compass of duty. The auditorium was modest, clean lines, polished oak, American flags hung without ostentation. A row of young men and women stood in uniform, hands at their sides, posture stiff, faces unreadable. They had not been chosen because of politics, race, background, or optics. They were there because they had chosen to wear the uniform and everything that came with it. Marcus walked in through the side, unannounced. No grand entry, no preamble, but the room felt it, his presence changing the atmosphere like gravity, asserting itself. He wore his Class A jacket, stripped of medals, unadorned except for the insignia of service on his collar. Not rank, not ribbon, just history. Clean, quiet, undeniable. He was introduced simply. Retired Major General Marcus L. Chambers, United States Army. He walked to the front. No podium, no teleprompter, just a line of recruits watching him, the way people once looked at statues carved from memory and sacrifice. And Marcus looked back, not with judgment, not with pride, but with something deeper, expectation. The silence in the room didn't break. It evolved. It became something denser than quiet, something thick with understanding that needed no words to expand. As Marcus Chambers stepped back, his boots barely made a sound against the polished floor, but their weight echoed somewhere deeper than the walls. Those watching didn't blink. They didn't smile. They didn't clap, because something older than tradition had passed through them, something that required stillness, not reaction. And while his words hung like iron above their heads, beyond that room a different kind of reckoning was unfolding. The first came quietly through an unexpected source. An old campaign video resurfaced, one in which a former county judge, now a consultant for a private defense firm, praised Maddox by name, calling him a standard-bearer for law and discipline in a chaotic age. The footage, forgotten by time, found new breath on social media, and within hours the firm's inbox filled with resignation demands, not from clients, but from its junior attorneys. A screenshot of their internal message, "We do not stand behind shadows," was leaked, triggering an avalanche of coverage. Not loud, but precise. The second came from a church. A small-town pastor, once a family friend of Maddox's, had invited him to speak during a men's breakfast on redemption. He introduced him with strained warmth, trying to frame past controversies as learning opportunities. But a teenage volunteer, working sound that day, turned the microphone off halfway through Maddox's first story. Not accidentally, not temporarily. He simply stood up, unplugged the amp, and said, "No one here needs this lesson." No one stopped him. The video caught the moment not with applause, but with silence, and the sound of a folding chair being dragged away. The third fracture arrived wrapped in celebration. A regional sheriff's association planned its annual awards banquet only for the event to be quietly derailed when their keynote speaker, an author and former Army Ranger, learned Maddox had once sat on their advisory board. Without warning, he withdrew, citing a conflict between service and spectacle. He returned his advance and shared his letter of refusal online. It read only one sentence: "You cannot give medals to those who mistook cruelty for courage." The fourth didn't involve politics or police. It was a high school yearbook. One caption: a senior student, asked to name her hero, wrote, "Anyone who didn't laugh when the wrong man was on trial." That line, photographed and shared by her friend, turned into a mural, days later on a community center wall. No name was painted, just the words, but the implication was felt. Maddox's former colleagues, already scarce in public, were now hesitant even in private. Their email responses slowed. Their public profiles shrank. One retired officer, once photographed shaking hands with Maddox during a courthouse ceremony, found his invitation to a veteran symposium rescinded. The organizers didn't issue a press release. They just didn't print his name on the program. The photo disappeared from their website 2 days later, and the world moved on, not with outrage, but with precision. Meanwhile, the recruits who stood before Marcus did not need news clips or viral hashtags. They had witnessed something that did not require translation. When they were dismissed, they walked slower than usual, shoulders squared not by pride, but by pressure. Pressure the kind that comes from knowing you now carried something that wasn't given to you lightly. In the cafeteria that evening, no one laughed too loudly. No one complained about drills. They sat with posture sharpened by the awareness that someone had chosen to show up not for himself, but for a name not even spoken. In the dorms, a few opened laptops, searching his past. Not the controversies, not the news, but the fragments. The words he had written years ago from deployment. Lines never meant for print, but now passed between them like scripture. They read quietly. They read twice. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to, because they knew what they'd seen wasn't a speech. It was a transmission, a rare alignment between principle and presence. And as they closed their screens, folded uniforms, prepared for another day measured not in grades but in grit, they carried with them that single charge, etched now not in manuals, but in marrow. That honor wasn't in medals, it was in resistance to convenience. That to stand for others was the only true use of power. The auditorium emptied slowly, as if time itself had agreed to move differently in the wake of Marcus Chambers' words. Outside, the air didn't roar, it held. No one rushed him, no one called his name. The absence of applause wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Yet beyond those walls, the world, always impatient, was already finding ways to translate what had just happened into something it could carry. The footage, quiet, uncut, brief, reached the internet before the echo in the room had faded. And it didn't just circulate, it pierced. It became something the algorithms could not suppress, something no headline could flatten. It was played beside other moments, raw, viral, unforgettable, and it absorbed them. A soldier, watching from his phone at a layover terminal, removed his earbuds halfway through and stood up without knowing why. A teacher paused mid-lecture, set the clip on loop, and stepped out of the classroom with eyes wet but jaw set. It wasn't because Marcus had said something grand. It was because he had said almost nothing, and the world was not used to that kind of precision. And as the footage spread, the air shifted for those who had once made laughter their shield. The first viral rupture came days later, when a supermarket customer, upon recognizing a former department captain once close to Maddox, asked loudly, "Still think he made the uniform look good?" The man, caught off guard, laughed at first, but someone filmed him. The laughter, once his default, now sounded hollow. The clip went viral with the caption, "Laugh again, Lieutenant." It was watched 2 million times in 12 hours. The second came during a panel discussion at a local university, where a retired administrator, known to have dismissed several early complaints against Maddox, attempted to pivot a conversation on systemic accountability. A student raised her hand, calmly asked, "Did you ever apologize to the family?" The panelist froze, muttered something about context, but the clip cut before his answer. The silence did all the work. The third hit harder. A commemorative event at a regional law enforcement hall had quietly removed Maddox's name from its honoree list. But the plaque, already installed, had to be taken down. Footage of it being unscrewed, carried out backwards by a maintenance crew at dusk, caught the attention of a nearby passerby, who filmed without commentary. The video, captioned, "When Stone Can't Carry Weight Anymore," was played at the beginning of a national ethics symposium. The fourth came uninvited. A popular political podcast, usually combative, played Marcus's speech in full with no edits, then left 20 seconds of silence before cutting the episode short. The host, known for never yielding time, simply said before the fade-out, "If you're still talking, you're not listening." In each case, the story was never about Maddox directly. It was about what his absence revealed. The space he used to occupy now filled with reflection, discomfort, and the reckoning that follows both. These moments did not belong to Marcus. He had moved on, but they carried his shape, his outline, like a watermark pressed invisibly into the surface of every new question being asked. In the barracks, they didn't debate him. They referred to him as doctrine. When recruits lined up, their shirts straight and nerves jangling just beneath the skin, they spoke his name the way soldiers once spoke commands, not to worship but to align, not to glorify but to remember, what not to forget. That sentence, simple, undressed, weaponized with moral clarity, was soon etched beneath portraits in training academies. It was printed on small metal plates worn on lanyards inside barracks. It was whispered between soldiers not as folklore, but as a filter, the line you didn't cross, the standard you lived by. The city hadn't forgotten him. It had simply grown quieter around the memory. That was how it began, not with fury, but with friction. No banners, no protests, just the subtle chill that crept into the spaces where his name used to be spoken easily. The first ripple came without warning. A charity gala, once chaired by Maddox's brother, was forced to pause its program after a group of donors withdrew moments before the event, citing a discrepancy in moral alignment. No one mentioned Maddox by name, but his shadow stretched across the empty seats like a silent reprimand. It didn't go viral because of a fight or a scandal. It spread because someone recorded the emptiness in that ballroom, the sound of forks scraping empty plates, and applause that arrived a beat too late to hide the guilt in it. Then came the interview, a glossy news magazine feature on public service and legacy that, halfway through, turned cold. The anchor had slipped in a line. "Do you ever think about what it cost others for you to stay quiet that long?" The former councilman across the table froze. The clip didn't show him answering. It cut there. That was all it needed. People shared it, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. The third crack was less elegant. A high school civics teacher, once a vocal supporter of Maddox's approach to law and order, found her archived lectures resurfaced. videos of her minimizing systemic abuse while citing his policies. One video ended with her scoffing, "Some people wear uniforms like shields, not standards." Her words were used against her in student petitions. The board released a statement. Her contract wasn't renewed. The internet's response wasn't outrage. It was quiet coordination. Clips saved, timelines annotated, history made hard to ignore. The fourth moment wasn't documented by the media but by a phone in the back of a courtroom. A different trial, different names. But when the judge asked whether the defendant believed the system had failed them, the public defender, young, tired, deliberate, simply said, "It didn't fail them. You just listened to the wrong people too long." And in the gallery, someone whispered, just loud enough to be caught on mic, "People like Maddox." The judge didn't object. The words weren't stricken. They hung in the air like residue. Each of these moments bent the world slightly. Not enough to snap it, but enough to reshape how it held its weight. And all the while, no one asked where Maddox was now. No one needed to. He had become geography, a cautionary landmark that others walked around instinctively. He no longer haunted headlines. He haunted silences. And those silences, paradoxically, became louder after Marcus Chambers reappeared, not on camera, but in person. Not in protest, but in ritual. He didn't march. He didn't publish. He attended, quietly, purposefully. Ceremonies, memorials, commission meetings, not as a symbol, but as a reminder that symbols could lose their shape if left to rot. At one such gathering, a mid-level officer hesitated before reciting his oath, stumbling on the word honor. Later, he admitted it wasn't nerves. It was the memory of that one line, whispered in every hallway, printed in every guidebook, passed between recruits like a thread of fire that burned just enough to mark. Because Marcus Chambers didn't hand them glory. He handed them the burden that came with pretending the cloth meant something if you never proved it. He didn't give them a legacy. He demanded they earn one, and in doing so, he gave the military back something it had nearly lost in the noise: the soul beneath the salute, the voice behind the silence, the power of dignity that never had to scream to make the world listen. So they listened, not to Marcus Chambers, the general, but to Marcus Chambers, the man who never knelt, never shouted, never flinched, and never needed applause to be remembered. Because in the end, what he gave them wasn't a speech. It was a declaration, a quiet one, but one that would never stop echoing.